I'm sure many of you are familiar with Zoom meetings, team meetings, Skype meetings, or these types of meetings. This is our first webinar that I think HSE and IPS have put together. The reason we're doing this is we have been inundated with a number of questions from a variety of clients who, and the questions all seem to be pretty similar. Some of it is within our context that we can answer, and some of it is not. It's their legal or labor issues, and so we wanted to bring in a trusted partner, that being Norton Rose Fulbright, to help us put some context around, well, how should we return to work? For those of you who know IPS and HSE, this may be a bit of a refresher, but I can't help myself but to give you a bit of our context of our company. In terms of the company history, we've been around for more than 20 years, cobbled together a lot of safety companies over the years, kind of gleaned their expertise and have grown a sizable health and safety and environmental company that reaches from coast to coast. And under the umbrella of a U.S. enterprise called DXP, we have a presence in the entire continent of North America. We operate in Canada under two brands, IPS and HSE. Both of those brands support our health, safety, and environmental focus, predominantly in the oil and gas industry, but also in the construction industry. It's our goal to be your trusted provider in protecting your employees and your assets. So over the years, we have had a history of protecting our clients from things like heights and confined space, fire, and poisonous gas. Now we're in the context wherein we're having to protect our employees, or your employees, from a biological agent called COVID-19. It's not a stretch for us to do that. The PPE is similar. What is different, new and unique, are the protocols around that. And while we have really clear established protocols, both internally and you as a client or as a customer or operator would have the same in terms of how we deal with H2S gas, how we deal with heights and confined space. Those protocols are really defined and easy for us to operate in. The virus is new. The situation is fluid. The scenario seems to be changing from week to week. The statistics are changing daily, and decisions are being made outside of us. Sometimes the World Health Organization is driving it. Sometimes it's the federal government or the provincial government or even our local jurisdictions. So getting our hands around those protocols are pretty important for us, as I imagine they are for you. So the goal of this presentation is to help us to understand, or help you understand, what those protocols might look like, what options you have available to you, what are your rights as an employer, and what are your responsibilities as an employer. We're now 2 months into this quarantine, and many of you are getting anxious to get back to work. Some of you have hockey hair or rock and roll hair, and you're dying to get in to see a barber. I've taken care of that situation myself, so I'm okay. But I know many of you are considering, okay, how do I get back to work, and what do I need to do? The NHL is talking about going back to work. Twitter and Google and Indeed have all established protocols, and it looks like many of them will just have permanent work from home situations. That may not be possible for many of the people on the line. So we want to help put some context around that. So before we get into the meat of what the problem is and what some of the solutions are, I want to throw up a couple survey questions just to get a bit of a context in terms of how people are operating. So Lauren, if you wouldn't mind putting up the polling questions, I'd ask you to simply read through these 3 questions, and we'll take a look at your response. So first question, what is your organization considering, or when is your organization considering returning to work? June, fall, or are you just completely unsure? So go ahead and answer those questions. Secondly, what kind of work environment is your industry currently operating in? And are you considering this question? Are you considering returning your work to a remote, concentrated camp style work? Is it a drilling or completions style of operation, or is it downtown office? And thirdly, hopefully you can see this on your screen if you just scroll down, would you be interested in some advanced screening practices at your workplace. So Lauren, as soon as you're ready, or as soon as we are capable, can you show us the results?
Yep, we've got a few more answers coming in, so I'll give it about 5 more seconds, everyone, and then I'll close the poll. Okay, looks good.
Whoa, 62% are planning to return in June. 15% are just completely unsure. All right. It'd be nice to be able to cross-tabulate some of this, but this is good for discussion purposes. So we have some remote concentrated. It's possible that remote concentrated and camp style are really the same. Drilling and completions, big contingent there, and downtown office. Great. So imagine each one of those will come with slightly different protocols. The legal issues might be similar in all those scenarios, but those are interesting statistics. And finally, would you be interested in advanced screening? 85% are interested in that. Great. Well, that'll be the context of our conversation. The screen in front of you, or the slide in front of you, talks about the problems. I've highlighted this because it doesn't matter, it doesn't seem to matter which client or customer we are talking to, whether large or small, international or just a local business. They seem to be wrestling with the same problems. Employees are confused, wondering if it's safe, wondering when the return to work will be. They're wondering whether they have to go if their employer forces them. The employer, on the other hand, has the same kind of confusion. How will I keep my employees safe? How will I keep the business continuity? How will I keep my investors happy? How will I attract investment even? And lastly, how do I continue the business and pay our bills? So that is the context. Again, this is a really fluid situation, and the protocols that we established a couple of months ago, they've changed. The protocols that we talk about today will change. So we need to be prepared for that. We want to make sure you're prepared for that. We have some internal expertise in terms of a medical director, primary care and advanced care paramedics, occupational health nurses, and nurse practitioners that we rely on a regular basis. And in addition, where we are not able to answer those questions, we've engaged Norton Rose Fulbright to help us with the legal issues. So with that in mind, I'll turn it over to Karina, and we can dive right into the presentation. Thanks, and thank you for joining us.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much, Todd. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I am Karina Jones. I'm a partner in the Employment and Labor Group at Norton Rose here in Calgary. And having looked at our invite list today, I'm delighted to say that I'm already working with many of your companies on these very issues, advising them on how people can start to get ready to come back downtown as soon as possible or to other work locations. And ensure that they're doing that in accordance with their legal obligations and, of course, ensuring that everyone is safe. So we're delighted to partner today with DXP and their team. Certainly a great business relationship for us and exactly the kind of business partner that's important in these sorts of scenarios because, as Todd said, we bring the legal side and they bring the hands-on screening and other return to work protocols. So in terms of my legal presentation today, although it's the law, I'll try to keep it fun. And if I feel like it's getting boring, I'll throw in some anecdotes because I'm talking to clients all day long about real world situations that they're dealing with as they try to manage these topics. But to provide a roadmap of where I'm going to go with the legal side of this today, first, I'll discuss why efforts to mitigate or prevent transmission of COVID when you get back to the workplace are so important. Then I'll discuss how to go about creating a mitigation plan, which I know many of your companies are hard at work on, but certainly these things are evolving, as Todd has said, and that work continues. Then I'll discuss other considerations, such as the employment law aspects of that, privacy law concerns, and finally, I'll conclude with some general best practices. And so in terms of a takeaway today, the expectation is, and that will give you a full legal and occupational health and safety, return to work plan, but certainly want to give you some takeaways to help guide your thinking as you prepare to bring everyone back to work and reopen Alberta. Okay, so the first substantive topic we'll discuss, as I mentioned, is assessing and mitigating risk when reopening. There we go. Okay, and as we've seen on the media, it's really critical that companies get their reopening efforts right. I know that there's been some frustration from many companies with some of the stop-starts that Alberta's experienced to date on that front. Certainly I'm not privy to what goes on behind government walls, but you can see that the government's trying to walk a fine balance between getting people back to work as soon as possible and preventing some of the large outbreaks that we've seen at some of the essential services facilities that have been on the news. So in terms of getting your mitigation efforts right, there's a few different reasons why it's important to do that. First of all, from a legal perspective, all employers in Canada have a general obligation to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances to ensure employees are safe at work. Now we'll drill down into that in a bit, because of course that's a broad statement. Failure to do so can result in prosecutions under the applicable occupational health and safety legislation, some of which, of course, we've seen unfold on the evening news for some different companies. This general legal obligation is in addition to any COVID-19 specific legal requirements that may have been established for your particular industry or jurisdiction. And that's a really important takeaway from today as well, is that the government has been busy developing return to work protocols for industry specific issues. So when you're looking at the law that guides your return to work plan, always be aware that it's not just the basic legislation, but there may be certain rules that pertain to your industry. And then of course, apart from direct legal liability, there are a lot of other good reasons to take steps to prevent transmission in the workplace, one of which is of course keeping your employees safe. Another is public reputational issues that can occur if it's done too quickly or without a great plan in place. So to start, without a sufficient return to work plan or sufficient mitigation efforts, companies can face an increased risk that their operations will be completely interrupted because of an outbreak in the workplace. And, we're hearing this from clients all the time right now from, and they're hearing it from their employees. People like to work. We work hard here in Alberta. People want to get back at it, but we have to balance getting back at it on face-to-face with, of course, some of the potential risks that can come from that. And that's why companies are so hard at work right now putting the plans in place. As I've mentioned, and of course, as we've all seen, there's now some essential workplaces that have had difficulties with COVID outbreaks, and everyone is very wary of being the next company to experience that kind of outbreak, which again can of course shut down operations once you've just restarted them. As we've discussed, there's potential for reputational damage if it's done incorrectly or too quickly. And perhaps also just as important as reputational damage, robust mitigation efforts will also allow employees to come back to the workplace feeling safe so that they can focus on getting the work done. And that's something that I'm certainly helping a lot of clients with right now, is as they start to move to reopen in June. Actually, those polling questions don't surprise me. I know that lots of companies are getting ready to push go with a large, back to work plan for June. What they're already hearing from a lot of their employees is that they're hesitant to come for a variety of issues. Mass transportation, taking the bus on the way there. How, is the bus safe? How do they get there in a timely way? What happens if they're caring for elderly relatives? I mean, there's a whole number of different issues that companies will need to be prepared to address with their employees. When people return, they don't want to get themselves sick or their coworkers sick. So there really are a lot of issues that companies are dealing with as they prepare these plans. Of course, another takeaway is there's no one-size-fits-all approach. I have the benefit and the great privilege of working with clients across a number of industry sectors. Of course, being a Calgary born and raised lawyer, oil and gas is near and dear to my heart and also near and dear to my business. And these issues are extremely important when you're in remote work locations, drilling rigs. We have to keep the rigs running. How do you make sure that the people on the rigs are safe when they're on rotation? How do you make sure that they don't encounter people when they're off rotation? I have lots of clients based in Houston, down in the U.S. They've, they're further out in front of Canada. Quite frankly, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration is approving tests more quickly. So they're doing quite extensive screening, a lot of the drillers and a lot of the service companies in terms of getting people out on the rigs and those protocols. So certainly that's something that DXP is right on top of, and they'll bring, that they'll bring the market-leading solution to that when those remote workplaces are, they begin the more intense testing that's going on right now in the United States. Okay. So next, we're going to discuss some general legal obligations in terms of returning your people to work safely. This is something that I spend a lot of time helping clients with as well. The first comment is that reasonable care does not mean perfection. It means what is reasonable in the circumstances. So again, I mean, it's difficult, right, to define exactly what that means. Quite frankly, it's a well thought out, common sense approach. That's how I describe it to clients. So, I get questions like, can we require people to wear masks in our workplace common areas downtown? Well, common sense would dictate, that has been a federal government recommendation, and it would also depend on how many people are in your common areas during a day. So taking a step back, do you really want that kind of concentration of people in a common area necessarily when they return to work? That's something you'll have to decide. Perhaps you decide that you really don't want that many people in your lobby at the same time. Then unpacking that, if fewer people are there, should you require masks? Are you going to give masks to visitors? And of course, as they say, the devil's always in the details. So as I mentioned in a slide or two, not only is it the high level principles, it's getting granular on them. How is this actually going to work? Are you going to queue visitors to your workplace? Are you going to monitor people that are entering your lobby at the same time? I know many of you know, and I continue to hear this feedback. I'm happy to say that I haven't yet had to participate in this, but apparently queuing in downtown office towers has already become a big issue just because of elevator capacity and keeping everyone safe in the elevator. So, requiring people to come to work, maybe you stage a workforce reentry. These are all different options as you figure out which solution is best for your company. Okay, so of course we're in unprecedented times, so there's really no comparator in terms of what best practice would be, in terms of what the government would be looking for if your business was ever audited by occupational health and safety. It's quite frankly, did you think about these things? Did you make a plan? Was it clear and specific? Was it in writing? Did you take reasonable and due care in making these decisions and not rush them in an effort to return to work too quickly? So in terms of places that you can consult to determine what reasonable care may look like, as I've said, the government is publishing guidance daily, as I think we're all aware. So be sure to check the website. We always do. The Norton Rose Fulbright website, we are constantly monitoring those. As I said, we have a big knowledge research team at the firm that's continually publishing updates and articles on industry-specific requirements and all kinds of things that are coming out of the government. So certainly monitor the government websites. You can monitor our website, but there are excellent sources of information on this available on the internet. Industry standards, we're seeing lots of industry organizations publish their own guidelines and rules right now on what they require of people and what they recommend. And then, as I said, common sense. It's really one of the guiding principles of my practice. What makes sense in the circumstances, right? I mean, what's reasonable and practical, you need to do enough, but again, you don't need to necessarily do too much that cripples your business, right? So stay on top of it, keep protocols current in accordance with the latest update. I imagine all of you have already done this, but of course you need to have a coordinated approach. So we'll appoint a person or team to develop, implement, and communicate the policies that your team's developing. Provide necessary training to employees and encourage and enforce strict compliance. This last comment is an interesting one because it's human nature, right? When people get back to work, I mean, Zoom calls are one thing, but humans like to interact with each other. So it's one thing to have a great plan, but where I often see these things fall down is when people don't live the plan. So it's not just having the plan, but it's making sure that your people do it. And I'm sure that everyone will be vigilant in the first short while after return to work, but just keeping in mind that these are ongoing obligations. So people will relax, they'll become more informal, they'll start to spend more time together, all of which is fine, provided that it's not leading to an outbreak in your workplace and it's reasonable. So, you know, the takeaway on that comment is you can have the greatest plan in the world, but if you don't live the plan, that's where it will fall apart. So just continual monitoring when you get back to the workplace. Okay, before we move on, a couple of practical tips on preparing a workplace risk mitigation plan. I like this, the junior lawyer that prepared this for me, included some standard cautions saying that lawyers must always provide those. So here's my caveat, but I'm sure that you all understand this, that of course we're talking about general principles and specific legal advice will be, on a company by company basis. But certainly, all joking aside, it is important to check what rules and requirements apply to your industry because, as I've said a couple of times now, they are specific and one size doesn't fit all. So those are my caveat of today's presentation. We'll now move on to steps for a workplace assessment. Okay, so we're going to recommend today sort of a 4-step approach to developing your return to work plan. Again, pretty common sense, but it's important that you really think this through in a systematic way so that you've covered off risk. Because as I said, that's fundamentally, if occupational health and safety comes knocking at your door, what are they looking for? It's that you have a well thought out written plan in accordance with whatever rules pertain to your specific industry. And it's one that you're actually living and enforcing. It's not, somewhere nailed to the drilling shack wall, but everyone's out, talking to each other without protection on the rig site. It's really making sure that you don't only have the plan, that you're living the plan. Okay. All right, so step 1, identifying sources of risk in the workplace. Again, this will differ for all of your different companies, but some takeaways, right? It's high contact. This is a high contact virus. So where the high risk area is going to be, it's going to be when people interact with each other, and it's going to be when they have contact with surfaces. So we indicate in our speaking notes here that it's the most important step and also likely the most difficult. And the reason for that is, of course, what we've been recommending to clients is that you really want to trace, if you can, I even encourage them to write it down, a people flow through the day. Where do people enter work? Who do they interact with? What do they touch? When do they need to leave their work, their workstation? Where do they go? What's required? What's not? Can they work partly from home, partly from work? Do you want to stage re-entries? Do you want to have certain groups come back at certain times? Really thinking about the workflow of your particular workplace or work site so that you can determine, okay, this is what it looks like in a day. Now, how do we develop safety practices to match that? And as I've mentioned, it's important to get granular. What are all of the sources of transmission in your particular workplace, and how can you address those through safety practices? And we recommend that by doing an actual physical walkthrough of the workplace prior to re-entering, as I've mentioned. You could even walk through your plan, for different people. Okay, when this person enters, what does it look like? What protocols do we need in place? Okay. As I've mentioned, you should consider personal contact, equipment contact, surface contact, and then external. That's something that I expect many of your companies are already on top of. But, visitors, vendors, everyone coming and going from the workplace. If you're at a remote work location, who's coming and going from that remote work location? Do you need them to come all at the same time? Is there a specific entry point? How can you really limit those things so you can limit the risk of transmission? Here we have some examples of a group of employees attending at a morning toolbox meeting. Is there a way to do that remotely or from different offices? Employees congregating at the entry of the workplace at the start of a shift. Again, is that something that can be done remotely? Can directions be given another way? Of course, I'm not sure if anyone had heard of Zoom 2 months ago, and now everyone knows Zoom well. So lots of these things, is that something you can do by way of a Zoom link? Let's see, an employee in a shipping department physically passing a purchase order to a warehouse employee. What steps can you do, or what steps can you take that you haven't already taken to make your workplace further electronic instead of lots of manual touching of documents and other surfaces? Equipment contact. What to do with shared tools such as photocopiers, clipboards, forklifts. Is there a routine sanitizing associated with that? For all of us that have gone grocery shopping in the last month, which I'm sure is most of us, you'll see that the grocery stores have developed some great protocols on this, right? They have a person standing there sanitizing all the buggies as soon as they're dropped off. I mean, something like that may not make sense in your workplace, but consider, do you have those supplies on hand to ensure that there's a protocol for managing shared contacted surfaces? Other shared surfaces to think about include door handles, railings, surfaces in washrooms. What are the protocols around that? Cleaning machines, how do you ensure that entry and exit points are dealt with? Okay. And in terms of who conducts the walkthrough and how you assess these things, it's important to get a handle on what all of your different business units are doing in a day, and then feed that up to your organizational planning committee. Because again, your different business units will likely have different needs, and then that way all of those can be taken into account. You don't have to have the same plan for every unit. It's really developing, as I've said, on that granular level, what makes sense for all those different units and returning to work. Okay. So once you've done that, which quite frankly will take quite a bit of time, lots of companies have been engaged in this process for a couple of weeks now as they start to think about, okay, how can we get everyone back to work with these ever-changing requirements? That's step one. So step two, of course, flows from that. So now that we've identified the risks, the challenges, then how do you mitigate them? So this is also something that we recommend prioritizing, right? I mean, there's going to be the high level major risks, right? If you have big contact daily meetings, deal with those first, and then you can distill it down into, the smaller or perhaps more easy risks to control, i.e., all external vendors come to one place, it's one point of contact, you protect that person that's on the receiving end. That's likely easier to control than groups when, multiple stakeholders come together during a day. And then the third step is, of course, developing the risk mitigation strategy. So with each risk, you can begin by asking the first question, whether that risk vector, that contact vector, can be eliminated entirely. I've given some examples of that. For instance, moving to Zoom meetings during the day, staging return to work in shifts, decreasing the amount of touch points in a day, doing more things electronically, all of which I think companies have had to do over the past couple months as most people have been remote. So lots of this transition should be easier. Next, if you can't eliminate it, are there things that you can do to make it safe? So some examples of that we've discussed, phone or video check-ins instead of face-to-face meetings. And if you can't eliminate it, and it's fundamental to your business, then what risk reduction strategies can be put into place so that it can still be performed safely? So some examples of this, again, we've observed at the grocery stores, plexiglass guards to prevent transmission if there's someone at a high contact entry point, tape on the floor to indicate social distancing to ensure that people have a clear idea of where they should be at all given times to minimize transmission. Or transmission, sorry. And then the fourth step of developing a mitigation return to work plan is ensuring that, of course, you're monitoring it, right? Truly, this is the number one thing I see. I help companies with it, not just in the time of COVID, but all the time. We can develop an excellent legal policy manual for you. We can assist with excellent return to work strategies, but unless you're living them, unless you're really thinking about maintaining them, what's working, what's not, lots of this stuff tends to get shelved because people are busy and they just want to get back to work and they don't want inefficiencies in their day because everyone wants to, particularly in the summertime, right? I mean, we see this anyway. Calgarians, we have such a limited summer. Everyone wants to get in and get out. So the more cumbersome a workday becomes, the more people are likely to start avoiding those steps. So just thinking about, okay, once you have that initial reentry, hopefully for many of us in June, then, try the initial plan. If it's not working, then modify it. And people will welcome that because it means not only that the company's taking it seriously, but that you're engaged with your stakeholders. You're listening to them. You're not there to create barriers to efficient work. You're there to help keep them safe, but at the same time, get the job done. And, there's constant, as Todd said, medical information being issued. So fingers crossed there's a vaccine soon and things can go back to normal. But of course, and hopefully this is the last time we ever see this, but potentially not. So this is a great opportunity for lots of us to determine how we can keep our workplaces safe and how we can deal with a global crisis like this quickly, safely, and efficiently. Okay, next, we're going to discuss a couple of best practices. So in terms of the content of a mitigation plan, the first recommendation, as I've mentioned, is create written policies to implement your risk mitigation strategies and train supervisors and employees on those policies. Even though it can sound a bit pedantic, certainly written policies are key because that is part of your due diligence that occupational health and safety will be reviewing if there's ever an issue. So, lots of this will initially be verbal discussions when you're making your plan, but it is important to take the further step and distill that to an actionable framework that you can pull out if there's ever a question regarding your due diligence complaint. Second, all employers should create a reporting and/or screening procedure to ensure that employees do not attend at work if they're at risk of spreading COVID. So this is the pre-access testing that almost all of you indicated that you're interested in. As I've mentioned, lots of our US clients are way up in front of Canada on this. I'm dealing with lots of blood tests now, serum tests. They are doing everything they can to keep those people safe. Now, again, not one size fits all. That's for lots of our oil and gas clients sending people out to remote work locations. I haven't seen that level of testing in the workplace, but it may be the case. But I have seen lots of temperature testing, lots of pre-screening questionnaires, lots of constant monitoring of people, right? Because of course the information changes daily. So again, being a practical lawyer, I don't think it's practical to have your people fill out an extended questionnaire each and every day when they attend to the work site, or they may start to ignore it. But it is important to, inquire if anything's changed. What happens if they came in contact with someone who had a fever the night before? What happens if a close friend of theirs or a family member was diagnosed with COVID? What now? So it's important that you take those steps. Some real life examples we've heard of already is people taking buses out to work camp, and they've been on the bus together, and then they get off the bus, and one of them announces that they have a fever. Well, that's a huge operational issue, because now potentially you have an entire busload of essential people may be infected. So in that kind of example, the appropriate time to do this screening is before people attend at work or come into contact with one another. So then, of course, the question of how to do that, when to do that, will be specific to your workplace. How do you get this information from people before they attend at work and potentially infect the rest of your workforce? So things to think about when you're getting down to, okay, not only what are you asking them, but when are you asking them that? As part of your educational efforts, appropriate signage should be posted throughout the workplace regarding distancing, hygiene, and reporting. Employers should provide employees with appropriate personal protective equipment and be prepared to discipline employees who are found not using it. The second piece of that is living the plan, as I've mentioned. It's great to provide people with all of this, but again, human nature is human nature. Within 3 weeks, people are going to be sick of wearing masks in the common areas. So if they stop doing it, it's important that you enforce those rules. Because that's exactly when the problems arise. Because if an outbreak happens, then they'll ask you not only what your plan is, but how did you ensure compliance? Ensuring compliance inevitably means that some people might not be compliant. What steps did you take then against those people? Employers should also ensure that frequent sanitization is being conducted of high-touch surfaces, as we've discussed and we've seen out in different areas. And communication is key. It's very important that all staff understand both the obligations of the company and the obligations of the employees upon return. You should be very careful to ensure employees understand that the consequences of failing to adhere to these procedures are not only through employer disciplinary actions, but there's also potential consequences from the government. The government has created a framework for fining and other issues under the Quarantine Act. To date, we haven't seen a lot of that yet, but again, the government, of course, has put that in place to ensure that people take it seriously without fines and other prosecutions as potential repercussion, then it's less likely that individuals and workplaces will take it seriously. So the government has built a significant enforcement framework. Okay, and then some other considerations. Although we don't have time to get into great detail on all of these points today, again, this is why I'm a busy employment lawyer. These things sound easy in principle, but then it's dealing with what actually happens when you start to do it. So issues from an employment law perspective. As we've mentioned, you should not only create a return to work plan, a risk mitigation plan, But what other company policies may need to be changed or modified, adjusted to deal with these new circumstances? So beyond your occupational health and safety policy, there's de facto going to be a reconsideration of flexibility in work location. Is your company now willing to accept more remote work practices than it maybe did pre-COVID? I think the answer for a lot of downtown workplaces is yes, but of course that needs to be balanced with productivity. How do you keep people engaged and productive when they're not at the workplace? How do you ensure the correct parameters to do that? Ensuring checkpoints throughout the day to make sure that they still feel as though they're an active part of the workplace. But certainly re-examining remote work policies has been key. And this also, of course, helps to reduce physical interactions between employees. I've had lots of questions about employee accommodation. What happens if people are afraid to return to work? Can you force them to come back to work? What happens if they're caring for elderly relatives, young children? There's a whole range of employment law issues in terms of the duty to accommodate. How far does that go? What other measures can be put in place to assist those people? Are there limits on those accommodations? Then I've also been answering a lot of questions on employees' rights to refuse to return to work. This is particularly a challenge just given the timing of the year. We may not see so many refusals to return to work if we're heading into November, but heading into July, you can imagine that I'm hearing that lots of employees don't feel comfortable returning until September. By and large, that's a twofold issue, I think. The first, for many people, is childcare. Where do you put the kids with summer camps closed, schools closed, plus great weather, and everyone's been isolating at home, right? So it's important that when people start raising these risks with you, quick plug for your human resources group. I expect that many of you are managers today, but not necessarily the HR managers. So work with those groups, feed the questions and comments that employees are raising back to them, and then they can help guide you in terms of what documentation do you need from the employees, what position can you take, what kind of accommodations might you be able to make, those kinds of things. Of course, being aware of privacy laws, lots of this we just sent down to one of our US clients, a fairly extensive privacy consent, a written privacy consent, because they are doing a full battery of return to work blood testing and things that most Canadians would find quite intrusive, although I think we're going to see it come here as well, to be honest. Lots of these tests that they have done in the US are testing for antibodies and other things to see if people not only are contagious, but if they've been exposed and now perhaps they're immune. To being aware of privacy laws, what can you say about people? If someone's become infected, what can you tell their colleagues or coworkers? What kind of testing can you do? What kind of consents do you need in place? So all those things should be taken seriously. We are expecting that for companies that don't, employees will make complaints to the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. That's not unforeseeable, particularly depending on the type of testing that you may be contemplating. Okay. And I think that concludes now, Lauren, my section until we come to the summary. So I'll turn it back over to Chris at DXP to discuss some of the practical return to work considerations from their end.
Thank you, Karina. And as Karina mentioned, we've been dealing with the practical side of the things, the boots on the ground. So one of the goals for this presentation also is to provide you all a snapshot of kind of what's going on right now. Some of you may be very familiar with these practices. Some others may have heard of them through their organizations, and there's maybe some things here that you've never heard of before. So I think Todd touched on this. It was one of the first things that he mentioned is the importance of having fluid protocols, and that new data is coming in every day. We're learning new things about the virus. We're learning new impacts about it. And our practices on the ground need to be fluid as well. We may be adapting to new protocols. We may be communicating these out and having different practices, and just to make sure we keep that in forefront of mind. So I'll move on to some different different things and practices that that we've implemented into the field with some of our customers. We're also doing some of these with our own employees internally. And most of you may be familiar with the level 1 questionnaire. It's pretty much the exact same tool as 881. You've heard of that in the media. Some of you may even called it. Some of you may have been tested because of it. Now, I'll get into further description of that later, but level 2 is your temperature screening. We've seen this in the media in the last week. They're starting to do this at the airports now. Some of you may have this on site if you work at a drilling or completions operation. And then the third level is something that we may not be so familiar with, and that's rapid screening, divided into 2 spots with nucleic acid testing and serological testing. I'll get into that in a little bit more detail later, but we'll move on to a little bit more depth into that level 1 written questionnaire or verbal declaration. So if we want to move to the next slide, there we go. So with your written questionnaire, we can fill it out prior to arrival to site or to the office. The site can be take the form of many different locations, or else it can just be a verbal or a written declaration once you get there. This 881 puts out great protocols with that. I know there's companies out there who have just taken those topics to ask their employees those questions. And there's also ones who have taken those and added their own. So this can be very versatile. You can customize it to your needs. Some of the pros for this are you have the ability to screen people before they get to site. Karina brought up a great example of jumping on a bus. And this is a tool that could be used in that along with other tools. You can standardize these protocols and these questions nationally. There's customers that we have that work all over Canada and use the same questions to ensure that all their locations are getting screened towards their minimum standards or best practices. And there's also the ability for one point of data. You can take all this data, whether it be written, whether it be submitted and emailed to one certain spot, and then you can take this data and turn it into a traceability. You can look at if somebody tests positive for COVID-19 or there's inclinations that they may be carrying the virus. We can go back into your data and figure out who were they in contact with, what sites were they on, and we can come up with a plan with those results. And then just like any of the other methods, I'm gonna definitely stress the point that there is no be all or end all. There's no one best way of screening. Everybody's in different locations. We have different variables we're dealing with. We have different resources that we have access to. And one of the big ones with level 1 is we're trusting correct answers. Level 1 screening is only useful if the answers are actually answered with absolute honesty. And we know that especially in these times, there's cash constraints. There's people who just might deny their symptoms or just feel like they need to get to work, and that's their main priority. And then a lot of times with our setting, when we're dealing with oil companies who own the assets, who have many different contractors who come onto site, if we are wanting that pre-screening before they get on site, there's that agreement and that coordination with the contractors as well. What is the current state of this level of screening? Level 1 is all over the place, for lack of better terms. We saw it first integrated with 881, and then, or I apologize, 811. And it's also been used in office settings. There's offices where upon arrival every day you fill out your questionnaire, and that gets submitted to a health and safety representative from the company, and that is on record every day. There is on-site declarations at drilling and completions locations. There's online portals which you fill out every day, and that information gets transferred to a localized location. And then we'll move on to level 2. And level 2 is a layer on top of level 1. We're going to implement that verbal screening, that written declaration. And then I'm sure you're familiar with this, with the temperature screening. That is the add-on for level 2. With level 2, the pros we have are, it's actually physical screening. There is data showing us that this person does not have an elevated temperature, which is a indication that they could be carrying COVID. We can do it in a quick, timely manner. All it is whether it's a quick reading of the temperature of your head, or applications where thermal cameras are reading the temperature of individuals just as they walk by them. You can get a high volume of personnel through this type of screening and back to the workforce or back into an environment where they may be traveling to. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, there are some aspects of this level which may have some people fall through the cracks. Some of this includes people getting into close contact with possible COVID-19 cases if they're coming into an area to be screened. We haven't screened them before they get into that close contact area. One way to mitigate that is to ensure that prior to arrival on site, they have completed that written or verbal declaration. And then I think the biggest one that most people are familiar with is the fact that an elevated temperature can indicate many other things other than COVID. So that's when we come into instances where, are we turning people away who just have an elevated temperature because they have been sitting in their truck for an hour with their heat on? Are they 5 minutes late for work, and did they jog from one end of the parking lot to the screening gate? So this is where we're kind of sitting with those. And false positive readings. These are just kind of what I touched on with the elevated temperatures. Now, I can share with you that one of our protocols and the practices that we're doing right now with level 2 screening is having a 3 strikes you're out policy, where in the case of a high screening, that person is taken from that area. If they're in a heated truck, if they've just been running, they're isolated into an area because there is a possibility that they could have COVID-19, and then they're tested 5 minutes later again. And if they have another high reading, we could test them 5 minutes later again, and that's the 3 strikes you're out. After that elevated temperature, then we can conclude that perhaps you have an elevated temperature from an infection, and then you would be refused from the work site. The current status with level 2, as I mentioned, we are seeing it in the airports right now. It can take many forms as well. There's the on-site temperature readings where you're localized to one location of activity. There's also forms that have taken more like a check stop, where at the beginning of a road to many projects or a road to workplace camp, everybody gets screened before they even get on the location or the grand location or the large project, to ensure that we're not getting any possible COVID-19 cases onto that location. And then level 3 is the next one. This one you may not be quite familiar with. I know Karina mentioned down in the States, We're already seeing companies implement this, but at this point in time, with our rapid point of care testing in Canada, we're still awaiting Health Canada approval. So with the level 3 testing, there's 2 types that I had mentioned, nucleic acid and serological. The pros for this level of testing is we're actually testing for whether it's the DNA of the virus in your body or it's the antibodies in your body. It can give us a definitive response of COVID-19 infection. And as with the other ones, there are some cons to these screening types. It takes a little bit more time. Right now with the point of care testing, the ones that are awaiting Health Canada approval, we are sitting at around 15 minutes in order to actually get that test instead of the 5 seconds that a screening takes. It is more invasive. We're actually taking either bodily fluid or blood out of the body to test for it. There's an increase of cost per test. That may come into fact or into a matter if you're dealing with a high mass of people who need these tests done and who need to be screened. And in the terms of the 2 rapid tests, there isn't one all-inconclusive test. We're either testing for the antibodies or you're testing for the DNA virus. You don't test for both in one screening test as it stands right now. And as for the current status, as I mentioned, we're sitting here waiting for Health Canada approval. But in the world, it has been approved in other countries. And as Karina mentioned, we foresee this being a strong possibility moving into the future. So the next one, I'm going to dive into them to give you a little more brief description of which each test is. I'll start with the nucleic acid or the DNA test. This starts with a swabbing of the nasal or oral cavity and actually testing for the DNA test. This is probably the test that you're more familiar with. This is the one that, although not point of care and being a lab-based test, Alberta Health Services conducts at this time. As I mentioned, we're testing for the actual virus. So if you have the virus in you and you're shedding the virus, this is what picks it up. And then some cons of it are it doesn't necessarily indicate immunity. I know a big factor of bringing people back to work is who is immune, who has the antibodies in them. If somebody comes back to work and isn't immune and somebody else, we all know that many people become asymptomatic with this. And if somebody isn't immune, comes back to work, what are the implications of that? And then to add on that, what is a negative result for a DNA or nucleic acid test depict? It can depict 2 things. It can say you haven't gotten the virus yet, or it can also say that you have gotten the virus and you may be immune to it, but we don't know that with this test, as it only tests for the DNA of the virus, which your body may have already gotten rid of. The current state of this test is, as I mentioned, there's lab-based tests out there which public health is conducting, and that's where we're sitting right now. Now, the other serological rapid screening is the one that seems to be the buzz right now. I'm sure you've heard in the news, the antibody test. So now what happens with the antibody test is blood is abstracted for the test, and they test for the 2 antibodies that your body produces in the wake of COVID. Now, this is where the immunity comes in, but I'll add into the immunity aspect a little bit later on in the next slide. But yes, it does indicate antibodies in your system, and it can also indicate which stage of the infection life cycle you're moving into. We'll get a little bit more into that later. And it also identifies a person who has contracted COVID-19 and may have been asymptomatic the whole time. There may be people out there who never had any symptoms and are scared to go back to work. But what if they were asymptomatic, had gone through that, and now it's limiting their ability to get back to work? And then, as always, with the downfalls to this type of screening, antibodies we have an incubation phase. We have a time where antibodies, it takes our body time to recognize that we have the virus and we have to produce these. And one thing I'd like to add to all of these screening types is the importance that screening is just taking a snapshot at that exact moment. Whenever we do a screening, we're saying, okay, this is where you are at this point in time. Things could change in 5 minutes. Things could change in 3 days, a week. And I just want to stress the importance of making sure that we're continually practicing these screening techniques. We're continually making sure that our employees are not changing symptoms. And then current state of this one, as I mentioned, we're sitting at waiting for Health Canada approval. So the next slide that we're going to move into will give you a snapshot of the last two slides that I explained. And it shows kind of the difference between the two tests. So if you notice, the antigen test would be the DNA test. That's the time frame where we can see use of it. And then the antibody test is the serological test. So as you can see with the incubation period, we have a week window where an antibody test may not show up, but we may have an asymptomatic person who is actually shedding the virus. And I think the biggest takeaway from this slide is to understand that a best case scenario would be to be able to perform these two types of screening on a worker to get that snapshot at that time of if they're sitting on this infection life cycle, where they're sitting on it, or even they may not be on it. 2 negative tests may indicate that they've never been exposed to COVID-19 and they may not be shedding the virus right now. Now, SBL is a distributor that provided us the slide, a distributor of these antibody tests. So I just wanted to give recognition to them as we are using their slide. And then one of the aspects of the antibody test that we're too new into our data is, once we have these antibodies in us, how long are we immune for? We have data right now that with other viruses of that nature, we have SARS-CoV-1 where science has dictated that you have 2 years of immunity. MERS says that we have 3 years of immunity for that once we have the antibodies. And as we move on, as we gain more data, we'll be able to come up with these pieces of information for COVID as well. So if we want to go to the next slide here, we're going to discuss negative results. With negative results, the one point that I would like to stress with this is the multi-stage approach of negative results or screening practices to eliminate negative results. We have many different indications of COVID-19, as I touched on: elevated temperatures, antibodies, actually having shedding virus. And this is where we need to ensure that we're covering as many bases as possible when it comes to ensuring we're evaluating or screening our employees to the highest thoroughness possible. And then non-negative results. I know this is Karina dove into this in quite a bit of detail, but what happens when we have positive results? How do we quarantine? For our line of work, many of us, what happens if somebody tests positive on site? How do we get them off site safely? Where do they go to? What is the responsibility of the contractor? What is the responsibility of the owner of the asset? And this is something that needs to be looked at and put into all of our protocols to ensure that we have best practices set in place. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Karina to wrap things up, and go ahead.
And I'll just say, cognizant that we've gone a little bit over time, we're going to do a summary and then we're going to open it up for questions. So absolutely, if you need to hop off, we will have the link available. Otherwise, please stick around so that we can get to questions as they arise.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much, Lauren and Chris. I was just about to say the same thing. I always like to be timely because I know everyone's busy. So I think our final summary slide really says it all. You know, it's consider your workplace, take reasonable steps to mitigate the transmission of COVID when people return, develop a written plan, and just be cognizant of industry and government requirements and rules that are ever changing right now. Enforce the plan that you develop and stay alert and adjust it as circumstances change. And of course, both Norton Rose Fulbright and DXP are here to help you through that journey. So those are my closing comments. We have some examples of common questions that companies have been giving us if there's no questions from the group. But please let us know if anyone who's joined us today has any questions or comments so we can assist in answering.
And I don't see any hands raised. So if you'd like to just take yourself off of mute if you have a question, or use the hand raise button and I can come around. I'll give it a few minutes. Karina, if you want to go through some of your commonly asked questions, we could take a couple of those.
Sure. Okay, I'll just hit one or two. So I also see it's lunchtime, so I expect people would like to do that. So this is sort of the classic one that I probably deal with every day right now. Can employees refuse to attend at work once things have reopened? The short answer to that is no. Not if the employer has taken every reasonable precaution and they've deemed the workplace to be safe. So employees are required to return to work if the workplace is safe. And how do we know it's safe? Because you've developed your written programs and policies. So it's not optional to return to work. Now, of course, you know, I like to be as clear and direct as I can. There's always a couple of nuances. I mean, generally speaking, no, but what's happening in the background? Elderly relatives, childcare. Are there other ways that you can accommodate return to work? All of those things. Public transit is closely related to this. Someone told me yesterday that apparently Calgary Transit is only allowing 8 people per bus right now. So you can imagine what's happening to the queuing at some bus stops. When people get on the bus, you know, are they safe? There's all these return to work issues. But by and large, when you start to deal with this issue, the answer is no. People need to come back when you're ready to have them back. But of course, you know, there's going to be issues with that. So you're going to probably have higher contact with your human resource departments than you normally do. But, you know, I frankly see all of this as, you know, a time-limited situation, right? People are concerned. They're confused. They don't know what the rules are. Once companies explain those to them, I think that by and large, we'll see people want to return because they want to get back to work. What kind of screening procedures can employers implement for employees in the workplace? Chris has just done an excellent job of this. The rules are changing quickly, right? But the takeaway on that piece is what's reasonable. You know, so some of the blood tests that he's described, reasonable, certainly, you know, in perhaps remote work locations, but maybe less necessary in a downtown office environment. Todd might have some thoughts on these questions as well. Todd, did you want to give your thoughts on screening procedures and what might be appropriate for different workplaces?
Sorry, it just took me a little while to get off mute. Boy, I'm not sure. I'm not sure who the one that should be answering this question. Chris is probably in a better seat than I am to do this. You know, I would suffice it to say that we'd be pleased to work with your organization to figure out what works for you. You know, there's multi levels of screening, whether you're going to be in the field, in the camp, or in the office. And so I think it's important to, you know, we will keep our eyes on the pulse in terms of, or our fingers on the pulse in terms of what is appropriate in terms of Alberta health and public health, but what's appropriate and what's necessary for you, we can do that on a case-by-case basis. Chris, anything that you would add to that?
No, I would just kind of add the fact that that we have been working with our current customers. We've been working with them, cooperating with them. At the end of the day, there may be two different types of protocols between all the different contractors that you have on site, as well as your own protocols that you came in internally. And it's just the importance that kind of all the protocols work together. And there's that constant communication, the different settings, variations, and just taking everything into mind. So, and that it's always evolving. That's about what I have to add to that.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And quickly before we break, there's one final poll that Lauren's about to put up. If you could please answer that and submit, we will conclude for today. And certainly we're delighted to take any of your questions directly. If you'd like to reach out to us afterwards, always happy to help walk you through these things in more detail.
As mentioned,
everyone. Okay, Todd.
sorry, Vegas, I'll just jump in for a minute for some closing comments. As mentioned at the beginning, I think this was recorded. We're happy to distribute this if you're interested. I want to make sure we give credit where credit is due, and I really appreciate Norton Rose, Fulbright, Lauren, and Karina stepping up to the plate and helping us out with this presentation. The content is very useful and practical. SBL Technologies, we use one of their slides. They're one of the product distributors for serological testing. And once their product is approved by Health Canada, you'll have full access to that. And Chris, of course, thank you for your presentation. So, you know, to all our customers, clients, and even some employees that are on this line, we appreciate your interest. And I look forward to everybody getting back to work with a nice, clean, crisp haircut and a nice shave, and get back to full productivity and getting our economy going again. So those are my final comments. Thanks again for participating.
I'll leave the poll open. Otherwise, people are welcome to sign off.
Okay, goodbye, everybody. Have a nice sunny afternoon. Hopefully you can find a patio somewhere. Take care.